First of all, thank you very much, everybody. To connect. We are very happy to have you today. Online with Elias Khnasser. So the topic of today is multi-cloud and multi-cloud strategy. But before to start, I would like to give you a little bit of visibility about Hub Advisor, what we do, and why we decided to have a super guest star today as Elias as a key speaker for the live event of today. So my name is Ismail Sharkawi. I am the CEO of Hub Advisor. Hub Advisor is IT and digital expertise on demand. Our mission is to help decision makers, to take faster and safer decisions by connecting them with vetted experts able to share with them their recommendation, best practices, pitfalls to avoid in order to help them, to build their and execute their digital strategy. So we are in the business for a couple of months now. We are growing fast, and we are mainly working with CIOs, CDOs, and CTOs, in big and small companies. And one of the hottest topics that we have seen on the market for the last month is multi-cloud. We have seen a lot of companies, who have questioned about it because they were historically using Azure, for example, but then they acquired a company who is on AWS. So now you need to handle different cloud providers, and there are a lot of questions. So it happens when it's not really your decision, but you have to face a multi-cloud situation. But there is as well the opposite strategy. So you don't you are already using a cloud provider, but you want for many reasons switch to another one or add another one to the bucket, and obviously you have question about that. So because multi-cloud is so huge, it's such an important topic, we wanted to organize an event with somebody, with an expert, with one of our advisors on this field. And Elias, is one of the best in this area. So Elias, I will let you introduce yourself, and I'll let you obviously, speak a little bit about what you see on the market concerning multi-cloud. And please, to the participants, if you have any question, comment, anything to share about us, please do it on the chat, because we want the meeting as interactive as possible. We will start with a quick presentation from Elias, and then we would like to have an open discussion with everybody on the chat. Thank you very much, guys. And Elias, I'll let you go ahead.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the opportunity, Ismail. This is truly an honor. Hello, everyone. My name is, for the first time, someone actually says it right. So my name is Elias Khnasser. I am the Chief of Research for EK Media Group. I am a former Gartner analyst, vice president, focusing on cloud and edge. I also have launched my own YouTube channel. So if you like this type of content, make sure you give me a visit and potentially subscribe. And if you're interested in podcasts, we also have a podcast called Let's Talk Shop. So take a look at that as well. Like Ismail said, if there are any questions, let's keep this as interactive as possible. Please post in the chat. Ismail, because I'm in full screen, I'm not seeing the chat. So interrupt me at any point if there are questions. I'd rather that this be more of a presentation / Q&A as opposed to me just going through it. And if we wait till the end, then we wait to the end. But feel free to interrupt at any point.
I will be here. I will feel free. No worries.
Okay. Sounds good. Sounds good. All right. So the first question that I am often asked by customers is, do I need a multi-cloud strategy? And my answer, and to get to the point, because I'm not going to give you the typical, analyst answer of it depends, I'm going to say, yes, you absolutely need a multi-cloud strategy. I will tell you that you are going to use multi-cloud whether you kind of want to or not. Some customers, multi-cloud is happening on accident. I would say a large majority of customers, multi-cloud happens ad hoc and by accident, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But other customers are starting to notice what's happening to others, and they're trying to get ahead of the problem. They're trying to get to being more strategic about it, trying to understand a multi-cloud a little more. So as a result, you need a multi-cloud strategy. Now, it's important when we're talking about a multi-cloud strategy to also differentiate what exactly are we talking about. So in this presentation, I'm not going to be focusing on the software as a service or SaaS aspect. Because from that perspective, everyone in the world is already multi-cloud. You probably are using at least two SaaS applications of some sort. So I'm going to avoid the SaaS conversation because you're already multi-cloud, right? And with SaaS, it's got a different set of challenges. It's more about integration. It's more about identity. It's more about monitoring. It has its own set of challenges. Here, we're going to focus more on, do you need a multi-cloud strategy for infrastructure as a service and platform as a service? So IaaS and PaaS, you'll hear me say IaaS and PaaS throughout. And the answer again is yes. Even if you're happy with one cloud provider, I would advise you to start thinking about a secondary or even a third provider, and we'll talk about why in a second and the challenges that that also introduces. So do you need a multi-cloud strategy? Definitely yes. Is multi-cloud really happening? So the other question that I'm often asked by customers is multi-cloud really happening? Because sometimes customers are just used to working in their environment. They don't see, because they don't have an immediate use case for it, they don't think it's actually happening. So is it really happening out in the world? Yes, it's happening. And again, it's happening for a variety of reasons. Sometimes you could be with one cloud provider, AWS, Azure, Google, whoever your cloud provider is, and you could be really happy with your cloud provider. But then your risk department will step in and say, diversify. If you're a government entity, they will force you to at least have two cloud providers. So, and this happened to a major credit card company in the US. I won't name who it is, but it's a major credit card company where they were very happy with one cloud provider, but their risk department stepped in and forced them to diversify. So, is it really happening? Yes, and we'll talk about, what are the use cases and what's kind of driving it. Now, there is also a confusion as far as what is multi-cloud. Now, what I want to do here is I'm not going to give you the typical NIST definition or a Gartner definition for multi-cloud. I want to give you a practical definition for multi-cloud. I also want to make sure that we differentiate between multi-cloud and hybrid, because there's always confusion. We always have customers that will say, well, isn't multi-cloud a form of hybrid cloud? If you take that position, if you take that approach, then I would tell you that everything is a form of everything else in one way, shape, or form. So it's important when you're talking terminology, when you're talking definition, for you and your team to all be on the same page. It doesn't matter if you're right or wrong, as long as you're all on the same page as far as what does it mean to be multi-cloud. And in this case, multi-cloud can be an on-premises environment connecting to multiple cloud providers. I will show you examples of what we mean by that. But let's tackle first the difference between multi-cloud and hybrid cloud. And to do that, I think illustrations are probably the best way. So when we're talking about multi-cloud, consider your on-premises environment, your data center. As soon as that connects to two cloud providers, let's call them AWS and Azure, AWS and Google, Azure and Oracle, whatever combination you want, maybe it's IBM and Alibaba, as soon as you connect to two hyperscale cloud providers, then you're in a multi-cloud environment. Now, you can take the same approach and say, I don't have an on premises environment. So if I replace the on premises environment with a public cloud provider, let's say you've already migrated everything into AWS, or maybe you're a new startup, you don't even have an on premises data center. How do you become multi cloud? Where in that case, whichever cloud provider that you're on, let's say AWS, that becomes the equivalent of your data center. So from that perspective, as soon as you connect to two other cloud providers, you're in a multi-cloud situation. So if you're just on one, I'll show you the hybrid, you're in hybrid. So for you to be multi-cloud, you need to have your primary location connecting to at least two cloud providers. That puts you in a multi-cloud situation. Now, how's that different than hybrid? Hybrid is the idea that you're going to connect between one location and one cloud provider. Now, the hybrid connection can be a variety of things. It could be you've established networking connectivity between your on premises environment and your cloud provider. That is a form of hybrid. if you've connected DNS, if you've connected Active Directory. Those are all forms of hybrid architecture that allows you to say that I'm hybrid. So when we're trying to differentiate between multi-cloud and hybrid, hybrid is between one primary location and one cloud provider. Multi-cloud is between one primary location and two or more public cloud providers. Now, the same thing that we did with multi-cloud, if you don't have an on-premises environment, again, maybe you're a startup that just started in the cloud, then I would say hybrid for you is the connection between your primary environment, which happens to be the cloud, and another public cloud provider. This is an easy way for you to differentiate between hybrid and multi-cloud so that you are able to clean up the terminology conversation and you're not, you know, arguing over what does hybrid mean versus what does multi-cloud mean. Multi-cloud always has at least two and your primary. Hybrid is one and your primary, and that makes it an easier approach uh, to understand and to go through. So, how is multi cloud happening? We talked a little bit about that earlier on, but how is multi cloud happening? Multi cloud is either happening strategically, again, you're planning to be multi cloud, you're taking all of the necessary steps, all of the necessary approaches to be multi cloud. Multi cloud is happening ad hoc, which means one side of the organization is using AWS, and there's another side of the organization that's using Office 365, and they haven't talked to each other, and bada bing, bada boom, you realize that you have two cloud providers. That's another example. And then it's happening mandatory. Someone is forcing you to be multi cloud. So let's take a look at planned first. So all of these are ways where you're planning to be multi cloud. So, from a redundancy perspective, there are customers that will say, I want to be multi cloud because I want to make sure that if one environment fails, one cloud provider fails, I have another cloud provider, which means you are going to replicate your environment between AWS and Azure. The challenge, of course, when doing that is you are reduced to the IaaS layer. So you're dealing primarily with virtual machines, with containers, and with data because those are portable. They're easy to move from one cloud provider to another, but it gives you redundancy. So if AWS something happens to it, as long as you've replicated your data, you're off to the races. You're able to stand up the environment relatively easily. The higher up the stack you go in terms of platform as a service, the more locked in you are, and the harder it then becomes to move to a secondary provider. But we'll talk about that a little bit as well. Now, there's also cloud provider innovation. There are a lot of CIOs, a lot of CTOs that will say, I don't want to wake up tomorrow and realize that AWS or Azure have a new service that would give me a competitive advantage, but I'm not in one of these cloud providers. And as a result, I'm missing out. So they operationalize at least two cloud providers, sometimes more, so that they don't miss out on any kind of innovation. I'll give you an example here. It comes, the conversation of best of breed also comes into play. There are a lot of customers that like to use AWS, for example, AWS Redshift, which is their warehousing and analytics platform, but they don't like AWS QuickSight, which is their visualization services. So what they'll do is they'll use AWS Redshift, but then they'll use Azure Power BI for its visualization capabilities. Now, in this case, what the customer just did is they used best of breed. Now, there are some technical challenges that I'm sure are going through your mind as far as egress traffic cost and the cost of operationalizing a second cloud provider. If you have some of these questions, let's bring them up, and I'm happy to discuss. Reduced lock-in. Customers, when they're thinking about multi-cloud from a strategic perspective, from a planning perspective, there is the concept of they're able to tell their business that we are reducing the amount of lock-in. Now, look, you're never going to eliminate lock-in, and I don't think that you should be pursuing eliminating lock-in because if you look at your on-premises data center today, you're locked in today. Pick whoever you want. You're locked in with VMware, you're locked in with Oracle, you're locked in with Microsoft, you're locked in with whichever provider you have on premises, you're locked in. Lock-in is not a bad thing. Lock-in is what gives you rich capabilities, rich features. So lock-in is not a bad thing. We can always get out of a lock-in. There are three challenges to getting out of a lock-in. Getting out of a lock-in is time consuming. You have to plan to get to a new system. You have to learn a new system. It is operationally challenging. You have to have dedicated resources to that. And it is costly. You're going to have to pay a decent amount of money in order to move out of a lock-in, but it is not impossible. So when someone is bringing up, hey, we don't want to go to the cloud because of lock-in, the first question that I would advise you to ask is, okay, how long do we have to get out of a lock-in? That should be your number one question. So if your regulators are basically saying, hey, you need an exit strategy, you need to reduce lock-in, ask them first, how much time do you have? If they say, hey, you have a year or you have 2 years to get out of a cloud provider, then I would say you can pretty much get out of any kind of lock-in, no problem. If they come back and say, we want you to design an environment where we can get out of a lock-in in a week, then that restricts you to how you enter the cloud in the first place. And that goes back to the earlier point of the redundancy point, which means if you want that level of portability, then you have to restrict yourself to virtual machines, to containers, and to data, because those allow you to move quickly. But then you're missing out on all of the rich feature set capabilities of PaaS, which is one of the reasons why you went to cloud in the first place. So I would advise to always strike a nice balance between the two and don't be afraid to use PaaS services. And then the other option that we see is opportunistic use case placement. And this goes back to, again, the innovation, the best of breed. But here, customers are taking a strategic approach to basically saying, I am going to put application A on AWS, and I'm going to put application B on Azure. I'm going to put application B on Azure because maybe it uses, CIFS or SMB network shares, and Azure does that maybe a little bit better. I'm going to put application A on AWS because it has better availability capabilities, better resiliency capabilities, etc. So I'm deciding to put it there. So opportunistic use case placement becomes, again, something that you are strategically picking. So those are typically the reasons that customers are doing multi-cloud from a planned perspective, from a strategic perspective. Now, from an ad hoc perspective, there's a lot, right? So from an ad hoc, there's a lot. One of the ones that I hear a lot is team preference. So you have the early adopters of cloud. Those are typically developers. Those are used to AWS. They're used to the AWS platform. Those will typically gravitate towards AWS. You have your marketing teams. Marketing teams that started early are also potentially using AWS and are used to it. But then you have enterprise IT. Enterprise IT is a little bit late to the game, and they usually, not always, but they usually favor Microsoft Azure for a variety of reasons, primarily because of Office 365 adoption. So the way the ad hoc conversation goes is you have customers that are already on AWS, but enterprise IT is doing a migration to Office 365. During the process of this migration, Microsoft will give you Azure credits. They will give you support. You already need to extend Azure Active Directory. You're having potentially Express Route connected. So you have all of these things that are connecting to Azure, and then you take a step back and say, well, I have Azure credits. I already am using Azure Active Directory. I've got Express Route configured here. What else can I do with Azure? And again, bada bing, bada boom, Office 365 dragged you into Azure. The other team is using AWS. You're in a multi-cloud environment. Now you have to figure out how to do governance, how to do security, how to operate both of these environments. And that's challenging on its own. But that is something that I see a lot that happens. And then there's the idea that they're going to mandate, you're going to be forced essentially to do multi-cloud. Now, the best thing that I could think of for forced multi-cloud, and this is an actual customer that I talked to last week, is mergers and acquisitions. This is a customer that didn't believe in multi-cloud, although I've told them many, many times about this presentation. I've given them many, many times. This customer insisted on being a single cloud, and then without them knowing, the business went out and made an acquisition. This customer was very happy on Azure, I believe, and here comes the next acquisition that's on AWS. So they called me and they're like, "You're right. Now we've got two. So what do we do?" I'm like, "Well, the first thing we have to figure out is, Are we going to keep both, or do you still want to be on a single cloud provider? Obviously, they want to keep both. Let's talk about how we operationalize both, but let's make sure that we have the right process procedure in place so that if the business, again, makes another acquisition that IT doesn't know about, and here comes Google, that at least you're ready for what you would do, what the onboarding process looks like. So I would say mergers and acquisitions are another way where you're kind of forced to deal with it. We just bought the company. What are we going to do? You have options, but typically you would keep both environments. There's also the compliance aspect of it, where your regulators might basically step in and say diversify. We talked about this a little bit, especially if you're a government, but even if you're a large enterprise, they will come in and say diversify. And then there's procurement. Sometimes you don't even need the regulators, but the organization's procurement policy requires two vendors. So that again puts you in a predicament of, well, now I have to bring in another cloud provider. Can you change the procurement policies? Potentially. Do you want to go down and try to take on that battle? I would say pick your battles. Is it really worth it? Those are things that we can definitely talk about more. So architecturally, how is multi-cloud happening? Now, there are different ways that you can architect multi-cloud, but I want to first talk about two architectures that I see that are very typical out there, starting with what I call replicated multi-cloud. Now, in a replicated multi-cloud, you're essentially taking all of the assets that you have in one cloud provider, and you are using the exact same thing in a second cloud provider. So in the example that I have here in cloud provider A, if we have an app server and a database server, we are going to essentially replicate those to cloud provider B. Again, in this scenario, you are reducing yourself to the IaaS level. So VMs, containers, data, you're going to take the exact same thing and you're going to put it on the secondary cloud provider. Now here, once you put it on the secondary cloud provider, you have a couple of different options you can use it for. You're either replicating it and waiting for something to happen with cloud provider A, and then you can spin it up on cloud provider B, or you can essentially put a load balancer in front of both of those, keep both of them working, and replicate, synchronize the databases. Again, if this is an option that you're interested in, let's do it in the questions, and I'll tell you how that works. But it's perfectly fine. It will work. Is it ideal? No. But if you're worried about latency, for example, if you're worried about bandwidth, most of these cloud providers usually will co-locate in co-location facilities. This is that meet me connection. So again, depending on the region that you're in, depending on a variety of circumstances, but it is not unlikely that AWS and Azure are potentially in some kind of an Equinix location. Equinix, for those of you that don't know, is a co-location provider. So if they're in the same facility, essentially, it's a fiber cross connect. So it is not unlikely that you can get sub 5 millisecond latency when you're doing a ping between Azure and AWS. I actually have a really cool video. I will, if you guys are interested, I'll make sure you get a link for it on my YouTube channel that shows you how you can operate a SQL cluster that has one node on AWS, one node on Azure. The storage is at Equinix, and you fail over between the two. This is obviously not to say that I want you to go do this, but it is to highlight what is possible, what you can do potentially with multi-cloud. So you can do it just for DR, you can do it for HA, depending on the workload that you're doing. But replicated is a popular option for customers to consider, at least. Then there's what's called a distributed multi-cloud. So in a distributed multi-cloud, it is a little different. Instead of replicating things, which to be honest with you is a little bit of a pain in the neck, with distributed, what you're doing is you're putting certain components of the workload on different clouds. So you might say, you know what, I'm going to put my app server and my database server, let's say, on AWS, but I'm going to put my web servers on Azure. So what you're doing in this scenario is, to some degree, it's a de-risk, because if some portions of the application fail, you can stand them up on the other, but you are distributing the workload across multiple providers. Now, you're probably wondering, how does this work, or who's doing it? A good example of what I've seen customers do here, and this is where Microsoft, for example, and Oracle have a strategic relationship. So Microsoft and Oracle have decided that in some regions, what they're going to do is they're going to connect their regions. So you can have an OCI region connecting to an Azure region via a very high bandwidth, low latency link. And what they recommend that you do is keep Oracle workloads on Oracle. So if you have Exadata or other types of Oracle applications, keep those on Oracle, keep them on OCI for licensing, for performance, for features, etc. Keep those there, and then put everything else on Azure, web servers, whatever else you're going to put there. Put those on Azure because there's that high bandwidth, low latency link. Again, best of breed solution. You're able to de-risk to a large degree, and you're using both of these cloud providers. There's a ton of examples here of what I've seen customers do. Again, we talked earlier about the Redshift and the Power BI example as well. That would be another example. The Oracle example. There's just a ton of examples of what customers are doing. And I think this type of an architecture, we're going to see more and more of it as we move further into the future. I think the large cloud providers have no choice other than to interconnect more between each other, so become more like frenemies instead of just, hey, we're going to compete. No, they're going to take a position of, we realize that we need to be competing, but there are some levels of integration that are important for us to have, especially in the times that we live in, with the cyber attacks that everyone is talking about, there potentially happen, the war that's happening. There's a lot of things going on in the world where if a cyber attack or a DDoS attack were to hit one cloud provider, maybe they can take down one cloud provider. But if these cloud providers have a mechanism to interconnect so that if someone is under some kind of duress or stress, they're able to move capacity to them, then I would say it would be nearly impossible to take down AWS, Azure, and Google, let's say, at the same time. The capacity is just, it's who is going to be able to do it. Even governments won't be able to do that. So I think there's synergies. There are things that these cloud providers will do to interconnect between one another um, that we are not seeing today. Now, when you're dealing with multi-cloud, aside from the definitions, the terminologies, the architectures, and the business drivers, you also have to talk about operationalizing this environment. How are you going to manage this environment? And here, there's a couple of different ways, a couple of different positions that you can take. You can either use the native tools and basically train all of your teams to learn AWS's native tools, learn Azure's native tools, learn Google's native tools, etc., and operate each environment that way. Or you can leverage third-party tools. Now, the challenge with third-party tools is they promise you more than they actually deliver, and none, I would say again, none, zero of the third-party tools can manage all of the cloud providers at the same level or feature parity. So you're always going to have, one tool that will do AWS really well, but not Azure. They'll do Google very well, but not AWS, etc. So unfortunately, at this point, depending on what you're trying to manage, what you're trying to operate, your environment will be a mixture of using the native tools and using some third-party tools. Where third-party tools really shine, I would say, is in cost optimization. So that they do really well, and they'll do it really well across at least the top three cloud providers. They will be able to assess your environment and give you recommendations as far as, hey, maybe you're using a virtual machine that has too much capacity, reduce it. Maybe you're not optimizing your reserved instances. They'll give you options there. So for cost optimization, I think you can find a single tool to rule them all. For everything else, like monitoring, like backup, like provisioning, automation, I think you're going to be going back and forth between native tools and third-party tools. With that, I really hope this was valuable. I hope I shared some good information, and I would love to see what kind of questions you guys have.
Thank you very much, Elias. Actually, we received a couple of questions. One is from Tennessee, is asking, is there any tool solution to manage this kind of architecture?
So there's a lot of tools. The problem with tools is it comes down to what are you trying to manage. So for example, I'll give you some examples. If you're looking to automate, then again, outside of the native tools that AWS and Azure and Google give you, you can go to third-party tools like Terraform, like Ansible, like Puppet, like Chef. Those are all tools that would allow you to do CI/CD, to create an entire, automate the provisioning process. And these are tools that would allow you to, let's say you've configured, let's say you're using Chef or Ansible. Ansible's a great tool as well, and you've created these recipes, these templates, etc., for AWS. They're not very. You can, technically it's the same tool, so you would think, well, I could deploy the same thing to another cloud provider, and you could, but it's not super seamless, right? So you would have to then adjust these templates to work with the second environment. So from that perspective, these would work, and they would also work on premises. So you're able to create automation synergies between your on premises environment and your cloud providers using one tool. Just keep in mind, this tool, you would have to make modifications to it. It's not going to be super seamless. Backup tools is another example. You could use something like a Veritas Net Backup. Veritas Net Backup will work really well on premises. It'll work really well with the major cloud providers. It'll work well with their PaaS services. So this is a tool that would allow you to do consolidate the management of a multi-cloud environment across the board. Commvault will do something similar, and there are other tools. Monitoring is the same way. So depending on what you're trying to monitor, you can potentially find a tool that would help. Governance becomes a little bit different. So there you may or may not find a tool. The challenge with these tools is the features. So again, the tool will say I'll support both AWS and Azure, but when you start looking at capabilities, you'll find that they support AWS a lot more than Azure. So my advice here, because sometimes you won't notice it. So my advice is, first, do an assessment, do an inventory of the features that you need, right? Forget about what the tool can offer. The tool is going to offer a lot of features. You don't care. What you care about is, what do you need? And you're only going to know that by having someone that's been using AWS, using Azure, that understands where they're getting stuck. So inventory the features that are important to you, then go to a tool and say, how many of these features do you have? If they say we have them all, great. Do you have them all on both AWS and Azure? If they say yes, then as far as you're concerned, this tool is enough. If they say we have, let's say, 50% of them, great. When do you have a plan for the rest of them? Are they roadmapped? And when can I expect them? And roadmaps are interesting because they rarely come out on time, but it gives you an idea at least of where this company is going. So hopefully that was the answer you were looking for.
I think it's a complete answer. Thank you very much, Elias. I have another question from Bilal, actually. It is saying, very helpful presentation. Can you give us a concrete example that you saw or had with a multi-cloud architecture implementation? I think maybe Bilal is looking for, let's say, data or something like that. How much does it take or something like that? I don't know.
Well, so let me try. I mean, I gave the example of Oracle and Microsoft. That is a very popular example now, especially if you have Exadatas. That's very popular, where you would put it in Oracle, and then you put other stuff like your web servers, potentially your file servers. Everything else goes into Azure. Are you asking about like egress traffic, or did I miss something? Because that would be a popular use case. The other really popular one, again, is using Redshift on AWS and using Power BI is very powerful for Azure. It's one of the things why customers keep going to Azure, is the visualization capabilities of Power BI. So that would be another example where I've seen customers export the data out of Redshift and then use Power BI to visualize the data. Those would be two. If you're looking for, if you're asking about egress or data analytics or something else, I'd be happy to give. But those are two that I've seen that are pretty popular.
Okay, you can give one of them, Elias. It's okay. Other question. I'm managing the question. So we have Jorge, who is asking, what about Azure ARC?
Azure Arc is a very cool technology, I think. Azure Arc becomes more, well, I mean, I guess you can take a multi-cloud approach with Azure Arc, but for me, Azure Arc is more of a hybrid approach. right? It's more that you have, your on-prem data center, you have your edge locations, you have Azure, and you're able to extend your management, your governance over these, assets through Azure. So, are you going to deploy Arc on AWS? You could. I mean, you could, but again, there you would have to see what the limitations are because, and again, this is the last time I checked. Arc will do a really good job from a governance perspective. I don't think it's doing automated provisioning yet. I could be wrong. Maybe they've added it in the last round, but the last time it was more the governance aspects of it that they were doing really well, the identity, all of that, but there was no a provisioning of assets. So you would still have to stand up, let's say the Windows server, and then install, let's call it the Arc plugins in it. Arc is a differentiator for Azure. I think Azure is doing a fantastic job when it comes to their hybrid story. I think they have a very, very powerful hybrid story. And I would put Arc more under hybrid than multi-cloud. So again, extend to the edge, extend your on-prem data center. Um, can you do it on AWS and Google? Yes, but it's not as popular, let's say, so right now.
Perfect. And time is flying, so maybe we are going to take one last question. I have a question.
These are awesome questions. This is a great audience.
They are a little bit challenging, but this is what we like. So are we, Jorge again? Thank you, Jorge. So participative. We love it. So are we still stuck in managing each cloud provider on each one's tool console and command line?
Yeah. So from my experience, I would say, unfortunately, to a large degree, yes. Unfortunately. Um, should you be looking at third-party tools like, again, Terraform and Puppet and Chef and Ansible? I would say that's important. I think these tools keep getting better. I think we are going to get to a point where we can do a lot or enough at least to check most of the boxes. Are we going to get rid of the native tools anytime soon? I doubt it.
Thank you. So Bilal, in this context of multi-cloud architecture, what about provisioning and deployment constraints? And what about tools like Terraform?
So again, I think tools like Terraform are very good. And if let's say, when you have your Terraform, and you have all of your scripts and all of your templates and everything, your manifests, etc., that are configured for AWS, they'll work very well for AWS. But then when you want to use them on premises, or when you want to use them on Azure, or you want to use them on Google, I don't want to say you're going to start from scratch, but they will need a decent amount of changes so that they can work on the other platform. So it's not a it's not a showstopper for me. I would recommend that you guys look into some of these automation tools. They give you a lot of flexibility, and I think these tools are the future. This is how you're going to be able to build a very intelligent platform that is hybrid and multi-cloud moving forward. So I would recommend them. Just keep in mind that you have to understand there are limitations when you're using them.
Thank you, Elias. I have another question. Did you hear about Brainboard? I think good tool for multi-cloud architecture. Take a look. So this is more a recommendation than a question.
Yeah, please. I'll take a look. I haven't heard, but I would love to take a look at it. So if there's a link, Ismail, if you can send it to me, that would be fantastic.
Definitely. So I will connect with Bilal. I think he's very knowledgeable and intrigued by this topic. So it will be great to connect with
Yeah, I would love
him. I have a question from Sam as well. More broad question, but very powerful. What are the common mistakes that you see related to multi-cloud strategies?
Yeah, fantastic question. So I would say the number one mistake is not having a strategy. I would say that would be the number one mistake. A lot of customers will wait until they are faced with multi-cloud. Here's the problem: if you wait, if you don't do multi-cloud strategically, here's the problem. When you're using AWS, you're buying tools, right? You're buying tools for AWS, you're buying provisioning tools, you're buying monitoring tools, you're buying backup tools. And then comes Azure. If the tools that you bought don't support Azure at the same level, now you're potentially having to buy different tools. So what you want to avoid with multi-cloud is tool sprawl. You don't want to have two tools that are essentially the same thing, but you're using one for AWS and one for Azure. So my advice, even if you don't plan on being multi-cloud today, this is the best advice I can give you. Even if you don't want to be multi-cloud, even if you're very happy with one cloud provider, plan as if you had multi-cloud. So when you go to buy a tool, make sure that tool works with AWS, but it also works with, let's say, Azure. So identifying your secondary cloud provider, even if you're never going to use them, is important for the decisions you're going to make. So I'd say that would be number one. Number two is, I would say, also train your staff, train your engineers. And here specifically, I'm talking about infrastructure operations and security, because when we talk about developers, that's a different conversation. But I would say train your operations, your infrastructure operations folks on both clouds or on multiple clouds. So make sure they have all of the certifications, all of the training, all of the knowledge they need on your primary cloud. But once they have a good working knowledge of that, tie their bonus, tie some kind of KPI, incentivize them to take training on the other cloud provider. Because what you don't want to happen is, you don't want to get the second cloud provider. You have the budget, you have the money, you have the time, but you don't have the skills. So skills becomes another thing not to overlook when you're trying to do multi-cloud, especially if you're developing a strategy for it. So make sure training is part of it as well.
Thank you very much, Elias. I think we are good for today. It was great to have you on board. Just to let everybody know, Elias is one of our advisors. So if you want, to have an individual consultation, an individual chat with Elias, is obviously possible. With you guys, I will stay in touch and connected, and this is the kind of things that we do at Hub Advisors. We do one-to-one consultation, and Elias is one of our brightest, advisor, and we are very proud and happy to have him on board. Elias, I don't know if you have any last comment, any last thing to add to the live.
I would say thank you so much for the opportunity. This was an awesome audience. I loved your questions. And like Ismail said, if there are any other questions that maybe we didn't get a chance to answer, send it to him. He'll get them to me. We'll get them answered. And, if you guys need another, one-on-one consultation, happy to be able to help as well. I'd love to do this again soon, Ismail, maybe on either a same topic or a similar topic. But thank you for everyone that joined. This was my honor. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Elias, and thank you guys for connecting. Have a great day.
Take care, everyone.